again. So tonight we're going to talk about immigration, which is a huge topic this year. And we're really lucky to have Katie Meyer, Herbert Meyer, from the MICA project, which is the Migrant, Immigrant Community Action Project. She is an experienced lawyer who joined this staff part-time in the fall of 2014 as the program coordinator and legal advisor. She has been a MICA project supporter since its early days, and up until her hiring was an integral member of the board of directors. Prior to joining MICA, she practiced immigration law at the Blesch law firm in St. Louis. And prior to that, she was the legal director at Interfaith Legal Services for Immigrants. She also has taught immigration law and policy as an adjunct professor at Washington University School of Law. She brings enormous experience to speak to you tonight. She's a graduate of Washington University Law School and undergrad at St. Louis University. So we get both universities here. Please welcome Katie Herbert Meyer.
This is my first time doing a presentation where I have a crowd in front of and in back of me. So I will do my best to make sure everyone can hear me. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy that all of you are so interested to learn about different areas of the law. That is wonderful. Yeah, no, absolutely. As you just heard, I am an immigration attorney. I have been practicing immigration law since I graduated from law school in 2003. Most of my legal practice has been in the nonprofit sector. I did take a few years to go into private practice when I was having children, just so I could have a little bit more flexibility than when I was running a nonprofit. So I'm really excited to be back in the nonprofit sector. It is an extremely busy, fast-paced environment, but I really enjoy it. It's very satisfying to be able to try to meet such a need. Our organization alone, we are one of 4 nonprofit immigration legal service providers, and our agency alone gets an average of 70 calls a month from new individuals looking for assistance. Unfortunately, even with 4 attorneys on staff, we cannot assist everyone who calls us, and we do have to refer out many of those individuals. So the need and the demand for our services is very great, and we are happy to be able to do what we can to try to meet that need. So I have some presentations put together for you, 2 separate. We're going to do 2 kind of 45-minute sessions, and we'll take a break. I'm happy to get through what I have, but I also want to be a resource for you, so I want to answer your questions, okay? So I think what we'll try with the first one, I have a bit of a quiz, since this first one is kind of an introduction to immigration using kind of the myths versus the reality of immigration law. So what I'm thinking is, let's try to get through the quiz. If you have a question related to the topic we're talking about, please feel free to ask it. But if you have a question about something I haven't yet mentioned, let's leave that to the end. And I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes or more before we take that first break. And I'll open it up to you, and we can talk about any questions you have. And if there are just still pressing questions, I'm happy to carry them over into the second session as well. Does that, yes?
If possible for the videotape, could you repeat any questions?
Absolutely. Yes, if I don't, remind me when we get there, but yes. Yes, that is a great idea. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to start off kind of running through some myths versus the reality of immigration law. Immigration is one of these topics where, as an immigration lawyer, I get very frustrated that if you just go by what the news says, you're really not getting an accurate picture as to what the current state of immigration law and policy is, or even just immigration facts. If you want to go home and take a more detailed quiz than what we're doing, PBS does have a quiz that has all kinds of information, so I'm just providing that there for you for future reference. So, first question. How many people believe that immigrants are a drain on U.S. social services, meaning they receive social services? Anybody? Nobody? Couple people? Okay.
Could you define what an immigrant is?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Immigrant, academically, that's a very interesting question, because academically, under immigration law, an immigrant is someone who enters this country after having been approved for an immigrant visa, meaning they have proven they meet the requirements to give up their residence in their home country and change their residence to the United States. So an immigrant, by definition, is someone who is a lawful permanent resident or a green card holder. But that's not what we mean when we say immigrant, right? That's what immigration lawyers mean when we say immigrant visa. Typically, in this presentation and in general, when people talk, we're talking about anyone who is not a US citizen. So someone who was not born as a US citizen, either by being born on US soil or by being born to US citizen parent or parents in another country if they meet the requirements, okay? So generally tonight, I mean anyone who's a non-US citizen, okay? So are immigrants a drain on US social service resources? The answer is no. That is actually false, although we hear a lot of talk about that in the media. In fact, immigrants, including immigrants who have no authorization to be in this country, you might have heard them as undocumented, immigrants without authorization, illegal immigrants, any of those terms, even immigrants who are not authorized to be here actually pay into social service programs, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but they're not eligible to receive most social services. In fact, even LPRs, lawful permanent residents, what we all call green card holders, are not eligible to receive 31 different federal aid programs until they've had their lawful permanent residence for 5 years. So even someone who's gone through that lengthy process of filing a petition and going to an interview and getting a visa and entering, they still have to wait 5 years. Other individuals who are here on temporary visas, like students, visitors, temporary workers, certain exchange visitors, so often nannies, or when you go to hotels in certain areas and they'll have employees that have a name tag saying what country they come from. They come in on these exchange programs. They're not eligible for any sort of federal benefits at all. And like I said, I'm going to kind of quickly go through these. I'm not doing a lot of details, but you guys tell me what you're interested in. So let's kind of keep moving and we can see where we go. True or false? Immigrants pay taxes.
True.
You guys are correct. You do have that one right. Even undocumented immigrants are required to pay taxes. As the slide says, undocumented immigrants paid $11.8 billion. I was shocked. I thought I was going to read million. No, billion into state and local taxes in 2012. And this is kind of a strange area in the law, and I explain this sometimes to my clients as well, because the federal government, as we all know, is huge, right? There's all these different branches of the government, within even just the executive branch, there's all these agencies. So you have the Department of Homeland Security saying to someone, you're not supposed to be here. You're breaking the laws, you're not supposed to be here. Then you go over to the IRS, and the IRS says, we don't care if you're supposed to be here. If you're here and you're buying things or you're working, you have to pay taxes, right? So we have different agencies that have kind of different requirements, but just looking at state and local taxes alone, undocumented immigrants paid in $11.8 billion. Many undocumented immigrants also do actually have their income tax withheld. Many may not have a valid social security number, but are legally allowed to get something called an ITIN, Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. You go to the IRS and you apply for it, and it is for the purpose of paying your taxes. Because again, even if you're not supposed to be here according to the Department of Homeland Security, if you're here and you're working, the IRS says, we want your money. So the IRS has created this mechanism. So there are many undocumented immigrants who, by law, are not supposed to be working. But if they are, they can go get an ITIN to pay their taxes. And so their income tax is withheld. They are not eligible to receive any of the Social Security, Medicare taxes that are withheld, even though it's withheld from their income. Was there a question or just a, yes?
I do have a quick
Sure.
question. Would you please define the difference between an immigrant and a refugee and in terms of the benefits?
Sure.
Repeat the question.
Absolutely. Would you describe the difference between an immigrant and a refugee, and then talk a little bit about how benefits apply to them? So refugees are a bit of a kind of hybrid. They don't fall into the legal definition of an immigrant, like I said, when they enter, because they don't come in as a lawful permanent resident. They're not a non-immigrant, which is the legal term for everyone who comes in on temporary visas, because as a refugee, they are on a path to become a green card holder. So they're in this middle ground. So refugees enter the US already having refugee status. They were first determined by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as meeting the strict requirements of being a refugee, meaning they were outside of their country of origin and they could not return to their country of origin due to past persecution or a fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, particular social group, race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. And so the refugees may be in a camp, they may be in another city, and then eventually the US decides we're going to take a certain number of refugees from different countries, and the US goes in and does all their interviews and decides who to take. So by the time refugees come in, they've been designated as refugees by multiple international agencies and interviewed by the US. So they are brought in on a plane that they don't pay for. However, they are required to pay back their plane ticket after a certain amount of time. They are initially given benefits for a period of, refugee work is a little different. I don't remember if it's 3 or 6 months. So it's a very small period. 6 is what I was thinking. It's a very short period considering you're coming to a brand new country to be able to get a job, learn the language, be earning enough to pay for rent. It's a very short amount of time. If they still aren't on their feet, they can apply for an exception to try to extend it for short periods of time. I don't know what that upper limit is. The International Institute in St. Louis does most of the work with refugees. So we will often help them later on down the line in doing a legal process, but that initial resettlement is not something we do. So that's why I'm not quite as familiar. But they do have different rules for that, but theirs is all temporary. They aren't yet eligible for just general TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, what you consider welfare. They aren't eligible, they are eligible for food stamps for a shorter period of time, but they're generally kind of temporary, based on the need. But like I said, they're even required to pay back their plane ticket. I remember being shocked when I heard that. Okay, so let's again, we're gonna keep moving. I do wanna get everyone's questions answered. Okay, so who's heard this before? People should get in line to obtain status, right? Why do we have 12 million undocumented people in this country? Why don't they just get in line? Why don't they pay the application? That's a really reasonable question. The problem is, here's the answer. The short answer is there is no line to get into for most people. But this is kind of a little bit of a silly chart, and I didn't realize we were going to have kind of smaller screens, so I don't know if you guys can see it on your handout, but it's a bit of a comic, but it is kind of the reality that there really is not a line for most people. I'm going to do a quick Immigration 101 here, okay? I'm a fast talker normally, and I'm trying to be conscious of that, but I'm going to try to do this one kind of quickly. Okay, so there are 3 ways someone can, quote, get in line to apply for one of these immigrant visas. For most non-citizens who want to come to the US, that's the golden ticket. You want to come in as an immigrant. You want to have your green card, right? And there's only 3 ways to do it. Family-based, employment-based, and something called the diversity visa lottery. I'm going to throw out the diversity visa lottery first because it only applies to a very small number of people. The diversity visa lottery is kind of like what it sounds. It is kind of what it sounds like. The US State Department designates every year which countries around the world have the smallest percentage of their citizens entering our country as immigrants each year, okay? So which countries send the fewest immigrants to the US? And the idea is we want to diversify not the US population, just diversify the pool of immigrants coming in any given year, okay? So they said we're gonna devote 10,000 immigrant visas each year to the overall, out of the overall quota that will come from the diversity visa. And so immigrants literally can just apply. Now it's online, but you literally just kind of fill out a basic form to apply, and it's just luck of the draw. And if your name gets drawn, then you go through the process of paying the fee and filling out the application, proving you meet the requirements. It does require some minimal educational does require you met some minimum educational requirements and a few other things. But it really, this was created when the INA was created back in the 1950s, the Immigration and Nationality Act. And the idea was just to diversify who was coming in. So that is, you're lucky, that's kind of rare. The other two, family-based immigration, employment-based. If you would like to try to get a green card and you are hoping to use the family-based track, you need to have either a US citizen spouse or a US citizen parent or US citizen brother or sister or a US citizen child who's over 21. Those are the only people who can petition for you. Having an uncle, an aunt, a grandparent, a brother-in-law, a son-in-law, that won't help you. It's very limited, okay? If someone is a lawful permanent resident of this country, so someone is here and has their green card, they can only petition for their spouse and their children. And that's all. That's how our family-based track works, okay? The person who wants to come here cannot start the process themselves. They have to be petitioned by that relative who meets the requirement. So if someone hopes to become a lawful permanent resident, they need to first go to a relative who's a US citizen or LPR, one of those really close relatives, and that relative has to pay the fees and file the application, basically proving to the government, I have this person who's in the right kind of relationship with me. Here's the documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, divorce certificates, whatever, DNA often, whatever the government asks for to prove that it's a real marriage, a real relationship. And then if the petitioner, the US citizen or green card holder, proves the relationship, then the person who wants to come in then has their very detailed background screening. They have to pay additional fees, send in applications, have an interview at the embassy if they're out of the country, if they're already here, and in the very small cases they qualify to get a green card here, they have to go to an interview here. And that's when their background is screened. Fingerprint checks are run with constantly increasing number of agencies, international and US agencies. So that's your family-based track. The employment-based track is very complicated. There are several different tiers of employment-based, but in most cases, we only offer employment-based visas to highly skilled workers. We do not offer immigrant visas, so the green card visas, to low-skilled workers. We have a few programs for temporary visas for low-skilled workers, but we have no programs for getting your immigrant visa. So we're usually talking people at the very top of their field. Usually you have to show you've been either nationally or internationally recognized, depending on which of the fields you're in. We have a few programs for nurses and teachers in areas where it's been demonstrated that there is a lack of nurses and teachers. In almost all of these cases, again, the person who wants to come to this country can't just submit an application. The employer is the petitioner. The employer has to file an application with usually the Department of Labor first, to get the Department of Labor to say that there are not willing and able US workers to fill the position. If the Department of Labor issues a labor certification saying that, then they file a petition with immigration, with the Immigration Service. So it's a very lengthy process, and again, the person who's kind of knocking on the door saying, hey, I really want to come, I'll be a great citizen, I want to come, they have no way to just go get in line or file the application themselves. Yes?
I used to process I-901s in Homeland Security.
901, okay.
And
Yeah.
some of what you just described, I just want to know that part of that employment, I used to see people from all over the world.
Sure. What is an I-901? That's not one I'm familiar with.
It's almost like your application, I guess like when you're filling out something.
Oh, sorry. Sure.
Or most of it.
She asked about a form I-901, said she used to work with an I-901. That's not one I'm familiar with, but we don't do employment-based, so it could be something related to employment-based.
I know that we used to have to, you have to take them all in.
Okay.
They had to go through the, I'm sorry. They had to go through the embassy, I guess, whatever country. And we had to, this was really, really, top security, because I went through a lot before even knowing that that was where I was going to be.
Okay.
So instead of the review being done, on all these applicants, certain things had to be in order, and we had to put them in via data entry into the computer.
Okay.
Everything we sent had to go to Washington, D.C. Homeland
Interesting.
Security.
Sure.
Then
Sure.
a few hours later, after they review it,
Okay.
then we would process, and we saw a lot of rejections.
Interesting.
And we had to,
Sure.
return those back to
Yeah.
wherever they were. But it was quite interesting. So I was wondering if that employment fell into that line.
Maybe. I'm wondering if you're talking about the old paper version of how they used to verify that someone was authorized to work, maybe, that, like with Social Security? I'm not sure what that form is.
That's what I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That was quite a few years
Sure,
ago, so,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, but the point of all this, just 1 second, is just to say that for most people, there isn't a line. So most of the clients who come to our office who are undocumented, many of whom are in mixed families, where some of the family members have immigration status or even citizens, and some have no status, it's not that they don't want to pay a fee or file an application. They would pay, most of them would pay anything. They would sell whatever they had to. Sorry, I don't know if that's me, to get status. It's that they just don't qualify. They don't have a U.S. citizen or LPR, lawful permanent resident relative. They aren't, in the top of the physics field. They're hardworking individuals, but they just don't have the right family members or the right degrees. So I'm going to get this question over here.
So how much corruption is involved in this process? Because I read an article in the New York Times about Melania Trump and how she got citizenship, and I didn't think we had a shortage of beautiful women in this country as models.
Yeah,
How did that happen?
I should, but I really just, oh, sorry. The question was about how much corruption is there. And then the reference was to how Donald Trump's wife came in on a visa. I think she came in on one of either a performer visa or, what do they bring the sports players in on? Again, I don't do employment-based. As you might imagine, as a nonprofit, we serve low-income individuals. So we don't work with, our clients aren't employers. They aren't people at the top of their business fields. So most nonprofits just don't do employment law. So I don't know the details, but my guess is she came in on one of these visas that we give to sports players. A lot of the, your baseball players who come in from other countries, they come in usually on temporary visas for outstanding athlete. I think the category is O's, outstanding athletes, performers, and something else. And they'll be on a temporary visa for a while, and then after a few years, say the Cardinals would be the petitioner, the employer, and would petition for them to get their green card under a different category of employment-based visa to give them their green card. So, my guess is she came in along some of those lines. I haven't, I haven't cared enough to look into the
Are there any requirements and/or exclusions because of health?
Are there any requirements or exclusions because of health? There are both, actually, yes. So just like I mentioned, just because someone gets an approved petition, so say someone is the spouse of a U.S. citizen who's living in another country, just because that petition is approved by immigration in the U.S. does not mean that spouse in the other country will actually get their visa, because the second step is their whole screening. And we do have a whole line of exclusion, or now called inadmissibility grounds, for people with communicable diseases. So you do have to take a medical exam. Tuberculosis is the big one. Up until very recently, having HIV was an exclusion ground. You couldn't get a visa. There was a waiver that people could apply for, but in recent years, that was taken off the list. So, tuberculosis is a big one that still does cause issues for people. But yes, everyone has to have a full medical. The other thing that does come up is prior drug use. Prior drug use is considered or having an addiction to drugs or alcohol is actually considered a medical ground that would exclude someone. So the background checks are quite extensive. Not only is it based on what you've told on a written application and in an interview, it's also based on a medical exam. It's based on whatever all the databases around the world say about you. Sometimes we would love to all think all of our clients are 100% honest, but I have had clients who've, come to me after they weren't truthful. And they're like, how did the government find out? I don't know, but just be truthful. So, I mean, the background check is extensive. It does include health. So you did I answered your question. So next question. You can file immigration papers yourself without a lawyer's assistance. Yes or no? Oh, I like this answer. Not a yes or no answer, but it's, he says you can, but it's very difficult. And that's true. There is no, you have a right to a lawyer in immigration cases, but there are no free immigration lawyers. Even for someone who's in deportation court, maybe having been here, lived here for 10, 20 years, they have no right to a lawyer to be appointed to them. You do have the right to have a lawyer, but a person could represent themselves, and many people do. They either go to immigration, ask for the applications, they download them online, they fill them out. But the statistics that are run by several different universities and something called TRAC that does a bunch of data analysis related to immigration has shown that the chances of having your application approved are significantly higher when you have an immigration attorney. In fact, one study shows that, well, several studies, the range is between 3 and 10 times more likely, depending on the situation and your type of case, to have your case approved. And if you're someone who's just interested in just general justice, it's like, well, that doesn't seem fair, right? Why should someone who can afford a lawyer get their case approved, assuming everything is exactly the same, and someone who doesn't have a lawyer not get theirs approved? And a lot of it is just knowing what immigration wants and how they want to see it. Packaging it so it's very easy for them. There's one really complex kind of case that we file, which we will often submit anywhere from 200 to 500 pieces of paper in support of this case. Really big for one client. I mean, it's such a waste of paper. And yet the statistics say that the adjudicator, the person whose job it is, the U.S. immigration officer whose job it is to review that application and make decisions, they are allotted 20 minutes per case to review and make a decision. 20 minutes. And they're getting dinged if they're taking too long on these. So as you can imagine, if you have a lawyer put together a packet like that with a nice exhibit list and a quick cover letter that says, this is what you're going to find, highlight these pages, go to this, and someone has 20 minutes, and they're going to see in 20 minutes the good stuff the lawyer wants you to see, you're probably a much better chance of having your case approved than someone who submits the same stuff but doesn't have it organized, and they put it in an envelope, and the officer's like, oh, man, another one of these? And the officer flips through and is like, I don't know, I'm not seeing what I want to see, right? So some of it is just, the people who make decisions in immigration cases are people. They're human, right? And there's that level of subjectiveness. And as lawyers, we have learned from experience and from other lawyers what's the best way to present someone's case, okay? A good lawyer will never help a client make something up. We don't ever add evidence. The client brings us the evidence, but it is about how you present something, okay? You could present a report to your paper, a report to a teacher in school, and you give it nicely typed up and stapled in the corner where the teacher wants it, and everything is right, and the content's good, you get an A. You could have the same content, but you've got it written in crayon on, the backs of newspapers all scrawled together. The teacher's gonna, not be interested in that. So, I mean, that's my take on, I think why sometimes it makes the difference. And the other thing is also just knowing what to send when. A lot of times people will get a case denied because they didn't remember to include photos, passport photos of themselves. And immigration will send a request for evidence. They'll say, we need this, say it's photos, or you didn't send in your daughter's birth certificate, or whatever. But the client is moved because it's been 2 years since they submitted the application. Immigration finally got to theirs in the stack. They've moved. Sure, the law says they were supposed to notify immigration when they moved. Within 10 days, the law says, within 10 days. But how many people forget to notify somebody when they move, right? And we've had so many clients who find out 3 years, 4 years after they filed an application, thought they were in line this whole time. No, it was denied 2 years ago because we sent you a letter asking for something and you didn't respond. So again, another reason why having a lawyer really makes a difference. Okay, I know I'm moving quickly here. This is just a graph that kind of shows the same thing. This is talking about people who are in immigration proceedings or deportation court. So someone who the US government is alleging that they should be deported. And as you can see, having an attorney greatly increases your chances of being able to prove that either, no, you're wrong, I shouldn't be deported under the law, or yes, I concede I should be removed, but I'm eligible for this way to stay here. Very often someone who's eligible for asylum because they would be persecuted if they went back to their country. Or I'm trying to think, there are some waivers. So if someone commits certain crimes in the US, pretty minor crimes, because it doesn't take much for it to be the type of crime where you have no relief in immigration court, but theft is a very common one. So say you have someone with a shoplifting charge, stealing a coat, and that would could get them deported even if they've been in this country for 10 years, even if they already have their green card. If they have a lawyer's help, they might be able to file an application called cancellation of removal, where they prove they meet various requirements. This is the only problem they've ever had. They've otherwise been a good person. They have family members who also live here, and it would cause a hardship to their family. They meet these requirements, and this is where having a lawyer makes a big difference. Okay, this is a big one, so I want to make sure we get to this, and then I can open it up to questions. If you have a child, a baby, in the US, you do not automatically get a green card. Is that true? I know I'm asking it in a negative. Who thinks it's true that you do not get a green card? It's true. You do not. You do not. This is a really common myth. I mean, this is a common myth even within immigrant communities. This, and if you marry a US citizen, you automatically get a green card, which I'm combining these together because I do want to kind of get moving. So a US citizen child born in this country gives their parents nothing at the time they're born. A US citizen child cannot petition, so that's that step one we talked about, cannot petition for a parent until the child is 21. The child must also be able to serve as a sponsor, a financial sponsor. In fact, any petitioner, anyone who petitions for a family member has to be able to do that. That means they have to meet a minimum income requirement. They need to show that their household plus the family member they would be sponsoring meets 125% of the poverty line or more, which is admittedly quite low, but that can still be difficult, as you might imagine, for a 21-year-old child. This process can also get pretty complicated, and it may not actually benefit the parent at all when the kid turns 21 if the parent has been in this country without permission since the child was born. Because if the parent has been in this country without permission since the child's been born, even if the child files a petition and it's approved, because yes, clearly you're the parent, it says on the birth certificate or DNA shows it, the parent has no right to apply for a green card in this country because the parent broke the law. They entered the country without permission, and they have stayed in the country without permission. So in order to try to get that visa, the immigrant visa, to come back in as a green card holder, the parent would have to depart the US. Well, guess what the law says? If you're in the US for more than 1 year without permission, and you leave the US, you are then barred for 10 years from returning to this country. 10 years, 10-year penalty. So for some individuals, they could qualify to apply for a waiver of that. A pardon, it's sometimes called, the law calls it a waiver. Unfortunately, in this situation, you aren't eligible for a waiver if the US citizen relative you have is your child. You're only eligible for a waiver, which is still hard, but you're only eligible to try to get a waiver, to prove, please, please, please let me come in, bend the rule for me, let me come in earlier than 10 years. If you can prove it would cause an extreme hardship, not just the normal hardship, okay, so you have to live away from your family for 10 years. That's what everybody faces. An extreme hardship to your spouse or your parent. They do not count extreme hardship to your US citizen child if you had to stay out for 10 years. So for most people, this whole idea of an anchor baby just really is not true. This is one of, as immigration lawyers, this is one of our biggest pet peeves, because it just really doesn't get most people anything. If someone has no status when they have a baby, it just really isn't gonna get them anything. So that's a big, 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 big myth that I wish we could actually, discuss using facts. But, as we've seen, especially recently, it's just one of those really hot button words that gets thrown out a lot.
Question.
Yes.
Who monitors this program?
Sorry, which program?
Who monitors the program?
I'm sorry, what program?
You said it can't be allowed back in for 10 years.
Yeah, so, well, he asked who monitors the program, meaning who decides, I think, or who would keep you from coming in.
Correct.
Right? Well, I mean, in order to get into the country, you're gonna go through either a land port or an airport or a seaport, right? So if someone petitioned for a visa for you, the idea is you're trying to come in lawfully. So you leave the country, you go to your visa interview. Let's talk about, a vast majority of our clients say that parent was from Mexico. So they go to their visa in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, right across the US border from El Paso. They go to their interview, and the officer's like, you meet all the requirements for a visa, but you are not eligible for 10 years. And they will be given a piece of paper that says, you're denied, you fall under this category, you're not eligible for 10 years. And they're told either come back in 10 years or file a waiver.
That's if they go to that office.
Well, that's if they try to, if they want to try to come in on a visa at all, they have to. That's the only embassy, that's the only consulate in all of Mexico that processes immigrant visas.
But that's in terms of doing it correctly and what you're saying.
Right, but I guess what I'm trying to say is if they didn't care about being undocumented or being in the country without permission, they would never have had a kid file a petition anyway, right? The whole point of having a kid do it is to try to get legal, right?
Do they have?
Do you know what I mean?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Do they have passports then?
Oh, yeah, most of our clients will have passports.
Immigrants does, or they
Immigrants?
have a passport? Mm-hmm. A U.S. passport?
Not a U.S., no, I'm sorry, not a U.S., no. Only U.S. citizens can get a U.S. passport. No, if you are not a U.S. citizen and you apply for a U.S. passport, that is a federal offense that is very strictly prosecuted. Only U.S. citizens can get U.S. passports. So no, they might have a passport from their country, very likely. You could go to the Kansas City consulate or Chicago and apply for a passport if you're, say, from Mexico. But yeah, I mean, if you're trying, again, to get in line, you're trying to do the right thing. You say, okay, I've got this kid, they're finally 21, they're gonna petition for me. I'm gonna go get my visa. It won't do them any good, yeah. So they'd either have to wait out the 10 years or risk trying to come back in illegally. But yeah, that's where, again, talking to a lawyer is so important. Yes?
60 Minutes or Frontline on PBS or something, some years ago, did an undercover thing about some folks women coming in from China
Okay.
in an underground kind of a situation, and to give birth in California, they had
Interesting.
safe houses and
Huh.
stuff.
Okay.
They were giving birth to these babies with the idea that the kid would be a U.S. citizen and therefore they could then come
Yeah.
in afterwards. Is that what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I don't know what that story is, so I don't know whether, like
And
that.
the mothers, I think,
Yeah.
went back to China.
Okay.
The kids were
Sure.
U.S. citizens.
Sure. And I mean, that is a very different situation than the vast majority of people I see where the parents have stayed here and they came here to try to make a better life for their family, so they've stayed here. In that situation, let's say that is what happened. Say a mother comes to the US, however she gets here, on a visitor visa, however, or sneaking across the border, has a child and then goes back. She wouldn't have a 10-year bar because she didn't, to earn the 10-year bar, like to earn that punishment, you have to have entered without authorization, or not even entered without authorization, you have to have been in the US without permission for 1 year or more. So you could come in on a visitor visa, you're allowed to stay 6 months, but you stay 3 years. You now, if you leave, you can't come back for 10 years. So if those mothers had just had a baby and left, then they wouldn't have the 10-year bar, but their kids still couldn't petition for them until they were 21 years old.
Oh, okay, all right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so they were counting on that, but the
Yeah,
kid, I
yeah.
guess they were looking to the future.
Maybe. I mean, I think a lot of this is the myth. I just think the actual reality of the law is not known in many communities, So let's go quickly, and I kind of gave the answer out, but again, just like having a child in the U.S. does not grant you a green card, marrying a U.S. citizen does not grant you citizenship or even a green card. This is another very common call we get, most often from the U.S. citizen spouse. We get a call at our office, it's a U.S. citizen born in Illinois, lived their whole lives in Illinois, and they marry someone who has been in this country for several years but has no status. And they call and say, okay, I got married to my wife last week. You know, what do we need to do? I want to fill out the paperwork for her to become a citizen. And very often people assume they, you know, jump to citizenship. But again, only people who meet the requirements will be able to actually get their permanent resident status based on marriage. There is a line drawn in immigration law with how a person enters. So the general rule says, even if you're eligible for a green card, you meet all the requirements. The normal process is you leave the country, this is where the line idea comes from, and you go to the embassy and you have your appointment and you get your visa and you get on a plane and you come in, right? There is an exception in the law to try to make it a little easier for people if they meet certain requirements to be able to get their green card in this country, meaning you're here now, you're here legally, we're going to let you stay and get your green card. Avoid that plane trip there and back. And the general rule is in order to do that, you have to have entered lawfully, maintained constantly the whole time you've been here lawful status, and still be in lawful status on the day they're giving you your green card. That's the normal process, okay? There is an exception in the law for spouses of U.S. citizens. But listen closely. That only applies if the spouse of the U.S. citizen entered the U.S. was inspected and admitted or paroled. That's kind of an advanced topic, but the law says inspected and admitted or paroled into the U.S., meaning they actually showed up at this kind of gets to your point, they actually showed up at a land port, an airport, or a seaport, presented documents showing they were authorized and were admitted, okay? So it means people who entered on a visa, okay, in most cases. So that means someone who snuck through the desert, swam across the river, came in without having contact with immigration, and may have been here for 20 years. If they marry a U.S. citizen, they have absolutely no right to apply for permanent residence in this country. And in fact, if we're talking about someone who's been here for more than a year, remember, same thing. Their U.S. citizen spouse, born and raised here their whole lives, their whole family lives here. They marry someone, they file a petition, and they assume they're going to be able to live here together. Then they go talk to a lawyer and they get the bad news. Nope, here's how this is going to work. You file this petition. If you can prove it's a real marriage, which is a hurdle itself, immigration will approve your petition, but then guess what? Your spouse has to leave the country to get their visa. They're not able to stay here to get their visa. They don't qualify. And the minute they leave and cross the border, they now have this 10-year punishment, okay? So then they have to do that waiver process. And luckily for spouses, you can apply for a waiver. You can try to prove that you should be one of the people to get a waiver if your spouse is a U.S. citizen. It wouldn't have worked if your kid was a citizen, but it works if your spouse or your parent is a citizen. These are very common cases at our office. These are very common cases. And in fact, when I told you about the applications that are this thick and the officers are supposed to spend 20 minutes, that's the waiver application. Those are those waiver applications where we're trying to show hardship. We're submitting medical records. We're submitting financial records. We're submitting school records. We're submitting, proof that the U.S. citizen spouse is taking care of aging relatives. We're submitting anything we can to just show how much it would disrupt their lives to have the non-citizen spouse either have to stay out for 10 years and they have to live apart, or for the U.S. citizen to relocate to the foreign country for that 10 years. So again, another really big myth that just marrying a U.S. citizen means you either automatically get citizenship or even a green card. Some people it is easy, for some people it is easier. A situation where it is much easier, you have a non-citizen who came in on a student visa. He has gone to school, done everything he's supposed to on the student visa. He's just about to graduate and he's marrying his sweetheart that he met in college, who's a U.S. citizen. Those cases do generally tend to be pretty straightforward, okay? Because he entered lawfully, he's stayed in the right status, he can stay in this country and apply for his green card, okay? And we do those cases as well too. But it's just not that easy for everybody. There's just this kind of idea that it's, just that easy for everybody. I'm just kind of gonna run through these really quickly, and if something grabs you, let me know. So the question is, can you apply for a green card if you come to the US with a work visa or a student visa? The short answer is just, there's no direct path to a green card on almost all of the temporary visas. So if you come in on a student visa, temporary work visa, so the temporary visas go alphabetically. From A, we're up to V now. So 20, how many letters are in the alphabet? So it's 24. There's 24 different categories, and there are subcategories under those. The only one I can think of that has a path to permanent residence, kind of, are these newer special visas they've made for victims of very serious crimes in the US. But the others, you would have to have an independent way, like I talked about, one of those 3 ways to apply for a green card. So many immigrants commit violent crime in the US. This, again, really, if you watch the news, you might really think that statistically immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than native citizens, right? I mean, that's the way the news makes it look. In fact, that is false. Higher immigration rates are actually associated with lower rates of crime. You know, most immigrants, you know, statistically, people who kind of study immigrant patterns, I mean, immigrants do kind of meet that idea that we have of really hardworking, trying to come to a new country and make it. Most people are not trying to get themselves brought to attention by committing crimes. Are there exceptions? Of course, right? There are exceptions in any community. You know, but do I want the news saying, you know, oh man, you know, 100 Caucasian, blondish-haired, you know, women committed crimes? You know, I don't get labeled into a group because other people who look like me commit a crime. But immigrants, like, you know, like many different groups, unfortunately, if there's something on the news, one undocumented immigrant or even someone on a student visa does a crime, it really raises everybody's alarms, you know. But statistically, it's just not accurate. Okay, I know I'm talking too much. U.S. deportation procedures avoid separating families. I wish this was true. I really do. It's not necessarily true. Over the past couple years, we're going to talk about this in the next session a little bit, but the administration has, on paper, said they were going to try to not prioritize removals where it would separate families, but unfortunately, we see this a lot. We have a lot of clients where we are fighting really hard to try to keep a parent or parents from being deported so that their children, their U.S. citizen children, you don't have to be separated from their parents. We've had a lot of families just have to make a heart-wrenching choice, especially when children are older and already in high school. Do I take them to a country where they just don't have a chance of, you know, really succeeding in life, or do we leave our children? But unfortunately, this is, you know, just not true at this point. Still possible, we'll talk in the next session, that either Congress or the next president could potentially make some decisions that could make it less likely that so many families would be separated. I was afraid you were going to ask it. Let me look that up on the break. There is a quota. The way the U.S. immigration system works, there is a quota. There's an overall number, and I just don't remember it off the top of my head. But then it breaks it down by category and per country. So some countries have longer waiting periods than others. Mexico, China. I'm trying to look at my graph, and what's the other one? Have many years longer. So for example, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, the average waiting time around the world is about 20 years for a sibling of a U.S. citizen to reach the front of the line. We talk about getting in line, it's about 20 years. But if they're from Mexico or China, it's even longer. So I know that wasn't really your answer, but in addition to having an overall quota, you know, worldwide, under every category, this many people can get a green card each year, then it's broken down to this many spouses of U.S. citizens, this many kids of U.S. citizens, this many, you know, it's broken down by category and then by country.
So when we let in the 10,000 recently, those are green cards, right?
Can you repeat the question?
So those aren't green cards. Those are refugees, don't get.
Right, refugees have a totally different category, and the question was, do the refugees count against that number? The refugee number is something totally different. Congress sets a limit, and in recent history, the president has never met that limit. The president has always authorized much less than what Congress set, so we are not actually fully using those numbers. Yes?
So why are Mexico and China required to?
Because more people from those countries apply for admission than other countries. It just goes, they just use up their numbers sooner. Yeah. Hold on just a second.
A few states a few years ago was considering giving immigrants a driver's license. My question, if those states hadn't enacted that, okay, an immigrant, say for instance, he's been here 5 years, okay, he's been catching a bus, catching the subway, going backwards and forth to work, and he decides, well, hey, I'm going to get me an automobile and I'm going to drive backwards and forth to work. Now, that would be what, a misdemeanor for a U.S. citizen, but would that be a felony for an immigrant?
Okay,
driving without a
I
driver's
understand your question.
license?
No, the criminal sanctions in general do not differ based on someone's citizenship. So it would still be, actually, those are usually a municipal ordinance violation. It's not typically even a misdemeanor. It's not usually a state offense. It's, you know, say it's the city of Clayton or it's the city of St. Anne that gives you the ordinance. So it's usually a municipal ordinance violation. The criminal sanction wouldn't be any more, depending on the judge. If the judge didn't like that someone was here without permission, a judge could give a stiffer penalty. But more often what we've seen recently is we've had these local police and municipalities entering into agreements with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the immigration police, where they would turn people over to immigration based on something very minor like a traffic infraction. So that was, you know, that's a way that what was a very kind of, if you're a U.S. citizen, what's considered a pretty minor infraction could end up with a very severe consequence in that you could be deported back home. Yeah, yes.
So is there some type of agreement between countries when you have the refugees that are fleeing from the other countries? Is there some type of agreement where the people are legally allowed to come to the United States as U.S. citizens, or how does that work?
Not an agreement with the country. I mean, the country they're fleeing, usually they're fleeing it because their country can't protect them anymore. But I feel like I kind of heard two different questions. The second part of your question seemed to be, are the individuals coming here lawfully? And yes, they are. Refugees go through many application processes before they come. They are coming in lawfully. They're not coming in as citizens. They come in as refugees. Refugees are actually a step below permanent residents or a green card holder. After refugees are here for 1 year, not only can they, the law says they shall, which means they must apply for lawful permanent resident status. And I mean, that is kind of more of just a way of making sure people are tracked, I think, but that they are supposed to apply for permanent residence. And then 4 years after that, so 5 years after they came in as refugees, they can apply for U.S. citizenship if they want to and if they meet the requirements. They, at that point, are not given any special treatment when it comes to citizenship tests. They still have to meet all the education, language, being able to take the civics test. They have to meet all those requirements independently. They're not given any sort of push then. So I feel like we should take a break. Oh, yes.
Is a visa, is a permanent visa and a green card the same thing?
Yeah. Oh, no, a permanent visa, permanent, say it again.
A permanent permission to stay in the United States permanently versus a green
card. Yeah, I'm using both just because green card is so commonly heard. Green card is not, you will not find that anywhere in the Immigration and Nationality Act, anywhere in the regulations. Green card is just a slang term because the very first permanent resident card was green. Okay, it's been many colors since then. Now it has all kinds of holograms. It's super cool if you can see one. Look at it. They now have all of the faces of all the presidents on the back. And I mean, it's teeny, teeny, teeny. You have to like get a magnifying glass out. I think those are on the back and the front's the flags, or maybe it's the opposite. But anyway, it's a neat card now, but it just was called a green card because the first one was green. But lawful permanent resident is the technical term for someone who has permission to stay permanently unless they commit crimes or leave the U.S. for more than 6 months. Okay, so we're gonna stop here. I think we should take a break. If we have any other questions, you guys can let me know and either come up to me over the break or let me know at the beginning of the next session. So if you want to ask a question, please go ahead.
we started last time with undocumented immigrants paying $11.8 billion in taxes. How do you document that if they're undocumented?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the one who does the study, but there's all kinds of different research groups that do this. I know there's several different groups that do it. Again, just because you're not undocumented doesn't really mean you're totally living in the shadows. Many do have ITINs, individual taxpayer identification numbers, but I think it's also just an estimate of the number that are in a state and in a community, and just based on sales taxes, what the sales tax rates are. I'm not a statistician at all, so I'm not sure how these statistical numbers are come up with. But I mean, as you know, you can't avoid paying taxes if you live. Yeah, you spend money, you're going to pay taxes, right? So I mean, a part of it, I think, is figuring out which percentage of the population and what they spend. Again, I'm not a statistician, so, that's what the research shows. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about coming to the United States as a tourist.
Okay.
Now, we've traveled to different countries. In some countries, we don't need a visa.
Yep.
Other countries, we do. What
Yep.
about people coming to our
Sure.
country? And then second part of that is, I imagine some people, if they were required to have a visa or not, they overstay their
Yep. Sure.
length of time they're really allowed to.
Okay.
So, do you have any
Yeah,
idea
I
of the
can
numbers
talk.
of
I can talk about that. I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but I can kind of describe that. So what you talked about, like if we as U.S. citizens go to some country, say I want to go to Spain, I don't need a visa. That's because we are part of the visa waiver program with Spain. It's a reciprocal program, which means it has reciprocity. Which means if we want our citizens to be allowed in without a visa, we have to allow their citizens in without a visa. So there is a list of countries that we have visa waiver agreements with. Many countries in Europe, Chile was the most recent addition, Chile in Central America. But it's a small number of countries. I don't know off the top of my head how many. I feel like in my head I'm thinking 32, but I don't even know if that's right. That's just popping in my head. So otherwise you apply for a visa if you're not from a country that's visa waiver. You might still want to, even if you are from a country that's visa waiver, if you want to make sure you're able to stay for a certain amount of time, you might still want to apply for visa waiver or for a actual visa. But whether or not you enter on visa waiver or a visa, a foil as they call it, in your passport. Either way, the visa waiver program, the visa in your passport don't determine how long you get to stay. That's decided when you show up at the point of entry. So the CBP, Customs and Border Patrol agent who inspects you, who asks you, where are you staying, how long are you staying, all of that, that's when it's decided how long you get to stay. And there's a stamp put in the passport, and it's written on the passport when you need to leave by. So that's how that's decided. What happens if somebody overstays? To be honest, the U.S. has a very poor system of tracking this. It's just very poor. And they know this, but they can't figure out a way to try to do it. Forever, we had these paper I-94 cards that we fill out when we go to other countries, too. And the idea was when you left, you're supposed to turn in this paper card. Well, they never ask for them a lot of times when you leave. People didn't have them. And a paper system just doesn't really work. So there has been this automated entry-exit system for a long time, and it's just not really working well. They're just really not, the technology. The joke kind of in immigration is by the time, and the government in general, by the time you can get something approved through all the different government security levels, technology is outdated. So they're always 10 years behind whatever the current technology would be to try to do a program like this. So there is not a good way to track how many people have overstayed. And so it really is a matter of apprehension, who gets caught. Yeah, and so, yeah, it's just really a poor system. Yes?
I was recently in Canada.
Yeah.
And they didn't stamp my passport at all. I mean, we were on bicycles, but
yeah.
They said, how long you'd be here, and they didn't do anything with it. How does that work?
There's all kinds of special rules between U.S. and Canada. Yeah, we treat the northern border a lot differently than we treat the southern border. But that would be Canada's immigration rules, not the U.S., so that's whatever Canada is deciding. It might be something where, if at certain points, areas where it's touristy, did they ask you, like, are you just coming, and if you're on a bike, they probably figure you're not gonna go too far north on a bike. I don't know. That'd be a Canada immigration.
Katie, do you want to keep taking questions, or do you want to try to go on with your presentation?
Should we keep moving? You want to find me afterwards? Okay. Let's move on. This is a huge topic. I have wonderful legal interns who were helping me with this, and I just didn't know what to cut because they put so much in here. So we just probably will not get through it all, but it's here for you, and it gives you some resources of kind of if you want to do a little further reading. So we're going to talk about kind of how might immigration law, policy, practice be impacted based on what happens in the election. So before we get to speculating about what might happen in the future, I want to kind of talk about what's happened in the last couple years as far as what action has the executive taken, what action has been taken by a president to give you an idea of what types of action, might happen in the future. So let's do a really quick civics overview, right? Okay, so we have how many branches of the U.S. government? Anyone? Yay! I love an attentive audience. All right, we have 3 branches. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. So the way it should work is that the legislative branch, Congress, writes our laws. They decide all the details, who qualifies for these visas, what are the requirements, what do they have to do? All of that's supposed to be decided by Congress. But Congress can also delegate. So Congress can delegate to agencies to make more rules. So how much is the fee? What form do they fill out? How many copies of their birth certificate do they have to send? All that gets done by agencies, delegated by the legislature. Then there's the executive branch. The executive branch is supposed to enforce the laws as written by Congress, right? As passed by Congress and signed by the president. But the executive also has in the Constitution certain executive powers that are placed on the president, right? The power to declare war, solely vested in the president. Certain foreign policy decisions, solely vested in the president. They do work together, and the idea is checks and balances, right? So that no one has too much authority. The judiciary, obviously, is very important. It's not as much of a topic here today, but the judiciary's job is to come in and decide when either the legislative branch or the executive branch are getting too strong, right? You're overstepping your powers, you're stepping onto someone else's toes, back off. That's kind of their role in this process that we're looking at. So immigration laws are kind of somewhat of a unique area. Yes, it's still true, Congress writes the laws, and Congress wrote the Immigration and Nationality Act. I should have brought it, I was going to. The INA itself, I'm trying to think, because my book has the INA and some regs. The INA itself is probably about that long. It's a really long statute, really, really detailed. And so, Congress writes that. They amend it many years. Recently, they haven't made any amendments because they just argue. They don't really make any decisions. At least in immigration, they just haven't made any substantive changes. But immigration law and policy is also something that has been vested in the president as having authority over. So there's kind of it's not one of these crystal clear areas. One of the areas that the president, the executive, not just the president, but the president and those below the president, have historically, going back to even before the Immigration and Nationality Act was created, the executive branch has always had the power of prosecutorial discretion, okay? The word prosecutor's in there, so let's make an analogy to criminal law. Criminal law is passed by our state legislature, right? Our state says it's illegal to jaywalk, right? It's written down. It's a law. It's illegal to jaywalk. The executive, so the governor and all the agencies below them, including the police and the prosecutors, what's their job? Enforce that law, right? So that, if taken literally, that would mean the police officer could get in trouble if they don't go give a ticket to every single person who jaywalks. But then you have the argument, well, so do we want our police officers giving tickets to everyone who jaywalks, and what if a major crime is happening and they can't go enforce that, right? Prosecutorial discretion has always existed. police and prosecutors have always had the discretion to decide which infractions or which laws are most important, which should we prioritize as a matter of public policy, okay? That's the same concept of prosecutorial discretion that goes all the way up to the president's office. And we have had a concept of discretionary decision-making, prosecutorial discretion in immigration law going back years, where the executive office has made decisions. They can't say you can get a visa, you can become a citizen, but they can say, if we have 12 million people who are here without status, and the law says all of them are supposed to be deported, and I'm not here at all to say that's not true. I mean, that's what the law says. If all 12 million of them were apprehended by an immigration agent, the law would say you're supposed to be deported. But the question becomes, what do we do if we don't have enough officers to enforce that law against everyone? How do we choose who we're going to prioritize to put into deportation proceedings and who we're going to say, yeah, we know you're not supposed to be here, but we just don't have the resources. You know, we don't have the financial and the manpower resources to remove. How are we going to make that decision? So typically that's done on a case-by-case basis. Someone gets arrested and that office says, we don't have any beds at our jail. And you know what? You have no crimes. You have 3 little kids. You're a working parent supporting those kids on your own. We're not going to put you into removal proceedings. We're exercising prosecutorial discretion. We know you're here. We now have your address. We might come after you again later. But right now, we're not interested in you. And that's always been done on a case-by-case basis. So from time to time, the executive has said, look, it's a big waste of resources for someone on a case-by-case basis to have to decide this. Why don't we give some parameters? Why don't we say, let's not even bother to go and first arrest people under certain categories and then make a decision, do we have a bed for them, do we not? Let's make a category of this is not where we're going to put our resources. And so I'm going to run through here. I'm trying to kind of do an overview of these. That was an overview of legislative power, prosecutorial discretion. Okay, so historically, this is not new. In fact, every single US president since Eisenhower has used some sort of executive action to make a decision as to how immigration laws should be applied. Now, we're not changing the laws. How should they be applied to categories of people? Okay, in 39 instances, again, going back to Eisenhower, presidents have taken action to protect families from separation, in response to foreign policy crises, or in recognition of pending legislation. So recognizing Congress has been talking for a while about doing something, so we're going to take some action now knowing that this is coming, okay? So if, for those of you who you know, remember this, President Obama has twice during the second half of his presidency issued these executive actions. I don't even know if they're technically executive orders, but it has, you know, issued this executive action. The first time was the creation of something we, as immigration lawyers, call DACA, but we have a lot of acronyms. It stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, okay? And in order to explain that, I want to talk a little bit about what is deferred action. Deferred action, much like prosecutorial discretion, is not new. Deferred action is actually written into the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's not in the INA, I take that back. It's in the regulations. It's in the regulations that implement immigration law. And deferred action is a process where an immigration agency, historically it has been either the customer service side of immigration, Citizenship and Immigration Services, or ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so like the police side of immigration, either one, makes a decision on an individual basis, looking at all the facts in someone's case, to say, we know that you are someone we could put into removal proceedings and try to remove, but for whatever reason, typically humanitarian reasons, we are going to, not only are we not going to put you in deportation and say, bye, have a nice day, maybe we'll see you in a few years, we're actually going to give you a piece of paper that says, we've reviewed your case, we are deciding not to take action against you at this time. And that's why they call it deferred action. It's not stopping action, it's deferring. Defer just means to put off to a later date. So deferred action is just a formal finding that based on your current situation, we have decided to defer, put off to a later date, taking any negative action against you, which would mean starting removal proceedings. By regulation, that person can then apply for permission to work for the period of their deferred action. The deferred action period is usually 1 year. Historically, that's what it's usually been. And the person would have to reapply every year. I have a great example from the first nonprofit I worked at. By the time I took this case over, this boy was not a child anymore. He was a young adult. But his story was that this young boy had been brought to the U.S. a few times on visitor visas from Turkey. He had a very severe form of a condition that I can't say the actual name for, but we call it brittle bone disease. Very severe form. I mean, he literally could not take a step without his bones breaking. Extremely painful. He had been to every doctor you could imagine in Turkey. He had been sent to Greece. They tried this experimental procedure where they basically gave him high doses of fluoride, which then actually is counterproductive and made it even worse, and now he had lost all his teeth. He had been through all these treatments for years, and his mom had brought him a few times on visitor visas to Shriners in St. Louis, and they'd get treatment. They would put rods in his bones. They'd send him home, and he couldn't get treatment, and he'd grow, and he needed new rods. So anyway, after multiple times of coming, they used up their visitor visas. They were told, we're not going to let you come in on visitor visas anymore. They were put in deportation proceedings. Judges in immigration law now, since 1996, have almost no discretion. If a person does not qualify for one of these black and white ways to stop deportation, a judge can't just say this is not fair. A judge has to make a decision. And so the only thing under the law they were eligible for was voluntary departure, which is just basically an agreement with the court where you say, I'll go on my own, please give me this many days, I'll go, don't deport me. So the judge gave him that. Before that ran out, they then had to talk to a different lawyer who said, let's just apply for deferred action. It's not even a thing, really. It's not a visa, it's not a status, it's literally throwing yourselves at the mercy of an agency and just saying, please consider stopping this because it wouldn't be humane. And luckily, the Immigration Service granted that. And I think they've had it since, I started in 2003, sometime in the late 90s. They've been getting this deferred action. But every year, they have to reapply, give medical documents, prove he still can't get treatment in Turkey, prove that they will not take any public benefits, that they have the means to pay all his medical bills themselves. So it's very detailed. You have to submit all your finances and everything, but every year he gets this. And again, the point is just, it's a situation where there's just no place for him in the law. When I said earlier, there's no line for him to get into. He doesn't qualify for any visa. And so he gets deferred action. So again, deferred action has existed, and it's typically been for humanitarian reasons, very often medical. So what President Obama and a bunch of people, and his immigration consultants came up with was this deferred action for childhood arrivals. So it was to basically say, we're going to say that a certain category of people, if they meet the requirements, can apply for this deferred action. Again, it's still case by case, it's still discretionary, had very strict requirements. You can't really have committed any sort of crime and get this. It's very much for the squeaky clean. This very much fits when I talked about the instances where presidents have taken this sort of action, that it was in recognition of pending legislation. I don't know if you guys remember hearing about this, but for a good 5 years, every year Congress would reintroduce the DREAM Act. Anybody heard about the DREAM Act?
Yes.
Heard about it? Dreamers, you've seen maybe the Dreamers on TV. The DREAM Act was an act, it was actually McCain and Kennedy, a bipartisan bill. John McCain, Republican, Kennedy, a Democrat. Every year after year, they would submit this bill for consideration. And it often made it through committees and made it to the floor, it just never passed. But the idea was, kind of the real passion behind it was that there are still are, a lot of really smart kids who are going through US grade schools and high schools at the top of their class, really smart, because the US Supreme Court decision from the 80s says if you are in this country, you have a right to free education through high school. And they said that absolutely applies even to non-citizens. So kids were getting these good educations, and then the door was slammed in their face. They could not get into college, they couldn't get scholarships, they couldn't get financial aid, and the argument was, this is just a huge brain waste. We are spending all these resources to educate these kids. They're clearly bright kids. Some of them, the really kind of ones that were that would go and talk in front of Congress, valedictorians of their classes, and then literally they can't get jobs. They have no permission to be here. They have no employment authorization. And so the idea of this act was that, for most of the kids who were active in talking about it, they were brought here as little kids. They had no choice in breaking any laws. You know, they were brought by their parents, and so the whole argument was, even if you think these parents are terrible, terrible people for crossing a border illegally, you can't blame the kids. That was the argument. That was kind of the bipartisan part of it. And so it kind of seemed like this was going to pass. So it didn't pass, and so President Obama said, you know, we need some relief for these kids. We've been telling them forever this is coming. So he created DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And so the idea, again, is that they would just get this temporary authorization to be here. The president has no authority to give them a visa, no authority to give them a green card. So in theory, or not I guess kind of in theory, but also in practice, they don't have any status. They can't say, here's my visa, here's my green card. But they are now, once they're granted DACA, in a period of authorized stay. It's a really weird black and white, or gray thing in immigration, where what's the difference? But it's not like they have a visa, they could go back home, come back in, okay? They don't have something to show, like, here, look, I'm supposed to be here. But they are in a period of authorized stay. Immigration says, we know where you are, we know you're not supposed to be here, but we're gonna make this exception and let you be here for a year. So in order to kind of, again, make this process more streamlined, they actually created an application process. And this is where a lot of the pushback came, was, hey, wait, hold up, you know, fine. It's fine for immigration to decide on a case-by-case basis if someone comes to them, we're gonna give deferred action. But you've just created a form for them to fill out, you've created a fee for them to file, you've written down these instructions. This seems a lot like you're creating a new program, right? It seems like you're legislating. And so there really has been a lot of pushback on this DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And then more recently, in October of 2014, when President Obama announced the second executive action, which was a slight expansion of DACA. It was to allow, it increased the age at which you could apply, but it created a new program called DAPA, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. And that program has never gone into effect. It's been stayed by a court in Texas, and the Supreme Court, they didn't agree or disagree. The Supreme Court was split, and they didn't decide that the judge was right, they didn't decide the judge was wrong, basically, but it just meant that the stay is still there. But DAPA was supposed to be for parents of U.S. citizen children. Again, not gonna give them a green card, not gonna give them a path to citizenship, not gonna give them any status, in fact, but it was supposed to give them permission to work while Congress is still fighting over all of this. But again, DAPA has not happened, so that Supreme Court decision came out very recently, but DAPA does not exist, DACA has not been expanded, but the original DACA has not, that is still going on. We still have clients today who apply for DACA. So I'm gonna briefly kind of talk about, you know, what DACA does, and then we'll kind of move on to what the next president might be able to do. Sorry, let me flip. Okay, so this is just a little sheet for you on DACA, which is, again, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This sheet comes right from the immigration website. You can go there and you can see this. Immigration is uscis.gov. You have to be able to prove you came to the United States before reaching your 16th birthday. And this, as you can imagine, might be hard to prove. I mean, it's not like you usually are waving a flag and taking a picture of yourself with a newspaper at the border like, hey, look, I got here, right? Because you're usually being brought here without permission. So it often is difficult, but they have to somehow prove that they were here. Usually school records, medical records. For our younger kids, that can be a little bit harder. They have to have continuously lived in the US from June 15th, 2007 up to the present time. So again, records. For most of our kids, school records are really good. We do run into problems over summer, and immigration will send us requests for evidence, or what they call NOIDs, Notice of Intent to Deny, if you don't satisfy what they say is missing, and oftentimes it was summer. We have no proof you were here over the summer. So we would have to come up with certain things. I remember one young kid really liked to play video games, and he had an account at a GameStop store. And luckily there, for some reason, they take like an ID. I don't know, he probably didn't have an ID, but he had an account with his name and his address, and it showed every time he'd gone to buy games and what games he had bought, so that was helpful. You have to have either entered without inspection before June 15th, 2012, or your status was expired by then if you came in on a visa. You have to either currently be in school, have already graduated from high school, or have your GED. Or be in, I guess you've already graduated high school if you're in college. But again, this DACA, the idea was it was trying to capture those kids who would have benefited if they passed the DREAM Act. So it was still very much geared toward kids who were doing well in their education. You have to have not been convicted of any felony, a significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more minor misdemeanors, and you have to not pose a threat. But that is just what bars you. That is, if you have those, you absolutely can't get it. Not having that doesn't mean you will get it. So you might look at it and go, well, geez, three or more misdemeanors, that's still pretty serious. You have to keep in mind this is purely discretionary. And remember, discretionary just means in the good judgment of the adjudicator, okay? So just because someone's not disqualified, they could still be denied just in discretion. And they have to be present in the U.S. on the date that DACA was created, which was June 15, 2012, which was another one of those issues. Why did they do it in the summer? It's so hard to prove our kids were here on June 15, 2012, because they're kids. So this is a program that, again, not created by Congress, but it was modeled after Congress. And it's the executive's attempt to try to say, what are we going to do? We have all these kids. They can't, while we're waiting for Congress to fight it out and what they're going to do, they can't get jobs. Some of them were able to get through, certain private colleges would enroll them, and their parents were able to pay for the colleges. They would graduate and say they were in a field like nursing, where you have to get a license. They were denied nursing licenses, or denied whatever field license because they don't have authorization to work in this country. So for many of them, it really was just a roadblock. So this is, a really concrete example of something a president can do that makes a positive impact on the immigrant community. I'm really jumping forward. Something a little that we thought was going to be positive, I'm really jumping through here, but kind of ended up not being as positive as we thought. I mentioned this earlier. Was something else the executive did is talk about what are our priorities for enforcing immigration laws. Again, we can't deport all 12, I think it's actually down to 11 or maybe even 10 million now, undocumented immigrants who are in this country. So what are our priorities? Who, if we apprehend, are we going to say, absolutely, we're going to do everything we can to fight and get you deported? And who are we going to say, it's a waste of our resources to have you sitting in jail for 6 months while we have your case. You should be taking care of those 3 kids who otherwise would be in foster care or whatever. How do we decide that? So they came up with this priorities memo, which has somewhat been helpful. The idea is that it was supposed to give tiers as to who Department of Homeland Security should be actually pursuing deportation cases against and who they should just be letting go. And they weren't even getting deferred action if they let them go. They're not getting permission to work. There's no real benefit to them other than they're not getting deported, which is huge. But in practice, it really seems to still be dependent on your jurisdiction. Here in St. Louis, the immigration court that covers St. Louis is Kansas City. So we have to go to Kansas City Immigration Court for our immigration court proceedings. And so it's the Kansas City deportation officers and the Kansas City immigration prosecutors, for lack of a better word, who make these decisions. And it really does seem to be very different what they do in Kansas City from what they're doing in LA, from what they're doing in New York. The idea had been it would make this more consistent, but it's had minimal success. So I'm going to skip over these details here. So I mentioned how The second executive action, not the first one that created DACA, but the one that expanded DACA and created DAPA, was stayed by a federal lawsuit in Texas. And again, just for time's sake, I'm not going to run through the claims, but they're there. You can read what the opposition was saying in that case. And then the Supreme Court split 4-4, meaning they couldn't make a decision, and so the lower court's decision still stands, and the lower court decided to put a stay on it. There's all kinds of politics involved in that I don't have to get into today, but the judge with whom the case was filed had made some very public remarks about how what the president had done was illegal. So there's lots of arguments that he was biased before the case even came to him, but it is what it is. Okay, so let's kind of move forward and talk about the candidates on immigration. This, again, brief overview. Obviously, it's there's a lot to try to cover. This presentation also includes some of the smaller candidates, but for time's sake, we're just going to talk about the two major candidates. So Donald Trump, as we all know, has made remarks about immigration, as has Hillary Clinton. He has put an extensive list on his website as to what he will do related to immigration. He says he has 3 guiding principles, as you can see. He believes very strongly that we have to enforce our borders, that we need to enforce our laws. This is something that's become something that he says a lot, and that we have to serve our citizens before other citizens. So those are kind of his guiding principles, that we really have to enforce the borders. He does, when questioned about the human cost of immigration, it does seem at times, to me as an immigration lawyer, that he perhaps doesn't understand the severity of some of these laws. I don't feel that he yet, or maybe he's learning, but even knows about the 10-year bar or some of these really serious implications of violating immigration law, because there have been times when he has made comments that make it seem like, oh, well, I wouldn't want to go that far. For example, he said, there certainly can be a softening because we're not looking to hurt people. We want people. We have some great people in our country. So it's unclear at times how much he realizes what the reality is, and if he did, once he does realize what the reality is, whether he would stay as strong in his, really it seems pretty black and white arguments at this point. He has the other comment you can see about having met some really great people who have been here for many years without status, and that it would be difficult to just throw them out, and that's a tough thing to do. Again, he's talking a lot in the second slide here on deportation. He talks a lot about that kind of there's one route, one path, kind of that same analogy of you need to get in line, you need to follow the path, that sort of argument. I'm just going to run through this quickly because I really do want to have a few minutes with you guys. Hillary Clinton has laid out a kind of detailed comprehensive reform plan. This is very similar to comprehensive reform that has been being pushed by Democrats for quite a while. Oops, I didn't go forward enough. Comprehensive immigration reform has been what the Democrats have been calling for many years. It's not just the DREAM Act, but the DREAM Act was part of it. In response, the Republicans would often say that what the Democrats are pushing is an amnesty. And so that's kind of been where the dialogue has stopped a lot, is just in terminology. Are we talking about comprehensive immigration reform? Are we talking about amnesty? Hillary Clinton actually does have some concrete plans that address some of the things we've talked about. She has talked about ending that 10-year bar we talked about. There's another 3-year bar that we didn't even get to, but talking about ending that 10-year bar so that people aren't automatically barred just when they leave, and having it be more they have to prove at the embassy that they meet the requirements. She does talk a lot about protecting families, enforcing immigration laws humanely. The interesting thing to note, and not that this at all means, not that this reflects upon what she would do as president, but some of these really harsh laws we're dealing with today were actually passed when Bill Clinton was president. And it's, you can't always blame you can't blame the president for the laws passed, right? I mean, Congress creates the laws, and it was very much a compromise, a group of compromise bills that went through that year. But the immigration bills that went through tended to be really anti-immigrant, and they created the 10-year bar. They created something called the permanent bar, They created a separate permanent bar for anyone who makes a false claim to be a US citizen, including minors. So some of the really harsh laws actually were enforced when Bill Clinton was president, and perhaps that is why maybe she has a more personal reason to want to change them, or maybe it's more political and just trying to say, I'm different than my husband. You know, it's hard to say. But like I said, I mean, so far she has kind of laid out some more specific details as to what she would do. I'm gonna scroll through this. Again, you can see Gary Johnson and Jill Stein in here as well. Just gonna kind of run through those. So we're gonna flip a bit here and just look at what are some possibilities of what might happen. Certainly, a new president would make a decision as to whether DACA goes forward. DACA, like I said, is still going forward. And so a new president would decide to either continue that program or stop that program. And that would be something that could be done literally just with, you know, signing a piece of paper. That would not take long at all. And so that, you know, that really is something that will hinge on what happens with the president. Possibilities from Congress. Again, there's still this goal of this more comprehensive immigration reform where it would have some sort of legalization program. You'll hear amnesty versus legalization, and I don't need to go into all of it, but the idea of amnesty as the word that is being used by the Democrats and the more pro-immigrant groups, the idea of legalization is that it's an earned legalization. The amnesty is much more, okay, I'm just wiping this away. We're just taking this off your record. Where legalization does require a lot of steps, including paying back taxes. It usually is many applications with various different fees, you know, proving you meet all these requirements, and it's usually not a quick path. It usually means you're first gonna get, the way it's been written, like a temporary residence, not permanent. Then if you follow all those requirements, you get permanent residence, and then you're on that same path of any other permanent resident to apply for citizenship. And so that's what's kind of been pushed as the Democratic platform of comprehensive immigration reform, which includes an earned legalization program, increased enforcement at the borders, some sort of changes in deportation policy to try to prioritize actually removing criminals and repeat offenders, people who repeatedly leave and come back in and get deported and come back in, and to not prioritize families and people with no crimes and that sort of thing. There's speculation every year. I know my slide says, like, Politico says the climate is right for this to happen. I don't know. I mean, they've been saying the climate's right on that for years and years and years. So the jury's out. We will just see what happens. But there's a lot of little reforms that may happen. H-1B visas, I didn't say that name, but H-1Bs are a temporary visa for your more low-skilled workers. There's a lot of kind of just problems with the program, and so there's various proposals out there to try to reform that program so that employers can get in the workers they need quicker and still have all the checks that need to be done. A lot of times, as it is now, by the time the workers get screened and get their visas and they come in, for seasonal work, the job's done, and now the workers are here. So kind of those sort of things. IT, there's a lot of talk about different, again, also making it easier for IT companies to bring in foreign workers. So we are out of time. I know I flew through that. I'm happy to stick around and ask questions. I don't know, do we want to take 3 minutes if people have any for open audience, or what do you think? 5 minutes? I don't know, what do you think?
Let me say one quick question. The people, the adjudicators,
She just wants you to wait for the mic.
the adjudicators, are they elected officials, appointed, and are they lawyers, or are they lay people?
Really good question, really good question. The question was the immigration adjudicators, are they elected? Are they appointed? Are they lawyers? They're not elected, they're not appointed, they are hired. They if you go to USA Jobs, .gov, I think, maybe it's .com, you can see all the open jobs for US government employees. You have to be a US citizen to apply for any of those jobs. But no, they are not lawyers. St. Louis recently lost 5 adjudicators all at once. They were supposed to have 9. They've never had 9 since I've been there. We had at most 6 or 7. They were down to 2 for a long time. 3 of the 5 they recently hired were lawyers, but was kind of a first. They typically were not. Each job, each tier is going to have different requirements. the way, the pay grades work, you're at different levels of the US government, and so I'm sure that they have different requirements based on pay grades. But yeah, it just depends. I think asylum officers who adjudicate asylum cases are much more likely, in my experience, to be lawyers, whereas the adjudicators that are doing interviews to decide if you have a real marriage or if it's a fake marriage or whether you meet the requirements for a green card or citizenship, they tend to not be lawyers, at least in St. Louis. Yeah, I did want to clarify something. Someone asked me at the break, and I just alluded to it, but just to be perfectly clear, no one who is not born a citizen can apply to become a citizen without first having lawful permanent residence, or what we call a green card. You have to have lawful permanent residence first. The normal rule is you have to have LPR, lawful permanent residence, for 5 years. There is an exception if you got your permanent residence based on marriage to a US citizen and you're still married to and living with that citizen at the time you apply to become a citizen, then you can do it in 3 years. But I did want to clarify that just so that it was clear that it's not an optional step to get the green card. You can't go from like a lawful temporary visa to citizen. You have to get a green card.
Does it include common law?
Does that include common law? That's a really good question. That depends. That's a state-by-state issue. So immigration will recognize a marriage if it was valid in the place where the marriage was created and it's a bona fide marriage. Bona fide just means good faith in Latin, and it's a bona fide marriage. So it's a two-step requirement. Was it valid in the place where it was initiated, and then can you prove the extra requirement immigration puts is that it's bona fide. And they want to see that you share a residence, you live together, you have a commingling of your assets and your money, so you share money, and you have a shared life together. So they usually, they want it my clients bring in all their photo albums and their plane tickets and everything. You're just trying to throw your life at them. Some of those interview questions can be very interesting. Yeah.
Somebody behind you. I just wonder, the more I see on television and read, the more I know of the confusion that people have. The more I know the confusion that people have about this 10 or 12 million people, because they think the illegal immigrants mainly come from the South.
Sure.
And the fact that half of them are approximately half are those short-term visas, the work visas, the visiting permits.
Correct.
That's half of the people. So these illegal people aren't all these people coming up, bringing in and smuggling.
Yeah, he was just saying how another kind of myth that I didn't mention is that there does seem to be a perception that all of the so-called illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, immigrants without status, that most of them are immigrants from our southern border who just crossed the border illegally. And they do make up a large number. I don't know the statistic you cite, but he is accurate that they also include people who entered on a visa and overstayed, and that is a significant number. And you might be right. I don't know if it is close to half or not. But that term illegal alien usually, or illegal immigrant, usually people are picturing someone who just crossed the border. But in immigration law, there is no difference between someone who came on a visa and stayed for whatever reason and someone who crossed. The difference is that penalty, though, they're going to face. Remember that even if they marry a US citizen, if they cross the border illegally, they can't stay and apply for their green card here. If they came in on a visa and overstayed and they marry a US citizen, they get to. So there is a little bit of a benefit in that situation.
Katie, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. You guys.
They come up and ask you
Yeah.
questions, but
No,
we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You guys have been excellent. I have to say, I've given presentations, continuing education presentations to attorneys many times. I have never had this engaged of an audience, so I really appreciate it. This is great. This is great.
You were great.
Yeah, no, thank you.